saying is they're flip sides of the same coin. You have to be a loyal team player. That's not optional. In fact, we're wired to suppress our own direct life experience and instead substitute the cultural package, especially in times of stress and fear and conflict. So we become more loyal, more polarized, all of that, and we just throw out our own direct experience. On the other hand, who are we fighting against? There's always an edge to that. There's always a clear, that's not us. We don't stand for that, and we won't put up with that. So the problem is we evolved to have our cultural package be in one single tribe.
Welcome back to the Dov Baron Show. If you're a regular listener, you already know my obsession with the intricate dance of culture and tribal psychology, whether it's in a corporate setting or society at large. Here's a thought that may provoke you to consider the importance of this subject when it comes to your leadership world. The word culture and cult have exactly the same root. You see, we're living in a time when these dynamics are more pronounced than ever, especially in these turbulent contemporary politics. In this two-part episode, I'm thrilled to sit down with my friend Tim Ash, a powerhouse in tribal psychology. Tim has a unique perspective on the rituals that forge cult-like bonds in everything from politics to Navy SEALs to corporate brands. With over $1.2 billion of value created for giants like Google, Expedia, Nestle, etc., Tim has the insights that you're just not going to want to miss. You really want to listen to this guy because he is a best-selling author of Unleash Your Primal Brain and has captivated audiences across continents at 200 events. His work is frequently highlighted and esteemed by publications like Forbes, Entrepreneur Magazine, and many others. So get ready for an eye-opening conversation that challenges your perspectives as we dive deep into the psychology of our times. Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting the subscribe button right now. The Dov Baron Show, it's not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Each episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. So turn up the volume and help me to welcome author of Unleash Your Primal Brain, returning champion, my mate, Tim Ash. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Dov. Well, after an intro like that, there's only one direction to go, and that's down. So
is it? Okay. I'm glad we got to have another combo, mate. I always enjoy my conversations with you. We often go off into all kinds of directions, but for the purpose of our audience, it's often a misconstrued idea. It's part of how our brain works. You know this better than most, is that we don't actually think about how people become who they are. I always like to start the show with context. What's the emotional source code of who we become? So give us an emotional source context of who you are, where you came from to become the Tim Ash who is here today.
Wow. Okay. I'm glad we're starting at the shallow end of the pool.
Exactly.
No, joking aside, I would say that the frame that I hold myself in terms of my backstory is that I am the child of two brave immigrants. I was born in the former Soviet Union in Moscow. It's now the Russian Federation. And my parents had the courage and the strength to emigrate from there, not knowing the language or even what country they're going to, with me at 8 years old and my little brother who was 5 at the time.
Wow.
To form a new life for us. So I figure that everything that my life is an artifact of that process, that I was an immigrant and that my parents gave up everything so that I could have an interesting and dynamic life. And so in a way, I owe them this huge debt, and I try to pay it back by not squandering the amazing opportunity that they gave me. They've both died, but I try to partially live my life in honor of them, I guess maybe is a great way to put it.
That makes sense. It's interesting to me because you and I have had these conversations before. My family, 3 generations, were also Russian in heritage, or certainly on one side. The impact of that, living in that Soviet environment, I know you were only 8, but that's old enough to remember that world. Do you remember what it was like to live there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I started 2nd grade there. We lived in an apartment on the 12th story, one of those prefab concrete, ugly Soviet multi-story apartment buildings. Across the landing on the other side was my aunt, her family, and my grandmother. So she'd walk us to school and kindergarten. My cousins were around. And how do I describe Soviet life? It's kind of like we were all in the shit, but everybody was in the shit together. And I think a difference from American culture is that people relied on each other, or rather, you depended on each other. My dad would always say, you have a choice of stepping on other people or helping other people. But there is none of this, you do you, I'll do me kind of stuff that Americans seem to value, this kind of alleged independence that we have over everything else.
It's really interesting to me, your work in primal psychology, and we've talked a lot about what it is that creates these bonds. It's a big part of my work, and I know it's a big part of your work, that you have outlined this whole process. But it's interesting to me because I'm always driven what's the driver underneath. And so coming from that culture that you came from is, in fact, a cult culture. The Soviet idea was a cult culture. The American is a cult culture, don't get me wrong. But that specific kind of cult, I can meet people who are Russians today in what is, quote, a democratic Russia. And I do put it in quotes on purpose.
You should put it in air quotes.
And I can still hear that there's a difference in the mentality of Russians, and it's almost that protective of Russia. And I see it in Americans too, but for a different reason. Even when they are outside of that, do you find yourself having both perspectives? Do you find yourself having a way to see both of those things?
Well, in a way, I used to say I'm 100% Russian or Soviet, then I was 50-50 American, then I was 100% American, and 50% Russian. And now I would say it differently. I'd say that your soul or your basic nature or your cultural imprints laid in real early. So I had that before 5 experience in that context. So I'd say I have some sensibilities of your typical kind of urban Muscovite, which is more of a lyrical, romantic sensibility and more of a communal feeling like we're all in it together. It's not very individualistic, or not as individualistic, that there are powers operating around you that you can't control or do anything about, that you're at the mercy of the Tsar. Those are constants in the Russian experience for the last 500 years. But at the same time, I can step outside of it and see the Russian Federation in particular for what it is. There was never any kind of democratic possibility there, even in the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell apart. It's always been an empire ruled by a strong man. The tougher, the better. And this is just the latest incarnation. And because of their undefensible borders, the Russian Empire has always had to spread out and try to cover these geographic choke points so that they could defend them more easily. And they're in the middle of another one of those brutal expansionist cycles right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. When I wrote my emotional source code profile on Vladimir Putin, that was part of the thing that I want people to understand, is that Putin is just another Tsar, and it's not unfamiliar to the Russian people. The West look at it and go, oh, yeah, how can the Russian people even accept this? Because it's baked into their entire DNA for centuries.
Exactly. That suffering also, and being at the whim of powers much greater than you.
Yeah.
And by the way, you put an American in that situation, you're either going to be dead or you'll be complying as well. The kind of pressures that are applied, they may be subtle, but they're so pervasive and that there's no getting out from under. Yeah, I have plenty of friends in Russia and in the Ukraine. It's brutal what they're doing in the Ukraine. I can't condone that at all. I stand on the side of the Ukrainians. You have to be a real exceptional Alexander Navalny or someone like Nelson Mandela level of self-control and personal power to be able to stand up to a system like that. It's designed to grind people down.
Yeah, and Navalny was such an amazing human being. I know his wife is now carrying on his work. I was praying for Navalny and consider myself a pretty courageous human being. I was not courageous enough to be him, get poisoned, end up in Germany, and then go back to be imprisoned and be cracking jokes while imprisoned in the far north, cracking jokes about why don't I have a six-pack when he's on a hunger strike. The guy was making those jokes. Wow, what a guy.
Yeah, like I said, I have no illusions about having a moral center that strong.
No.
I don't have it.
No. We're talking about the Soviet American thing. For me, being in my 60s, listening to what's going on, it's very reminiscent of the early 80s, which I remember very well, and being warned about nuclear war and all the rest of it. But your research and your thesis is that polarization is built into our evolution. Tell us more about that.
So as much as in the West, we like to think we're individualists, that's really an aberration, both historically and I would say it's completely inaccurate. From an evolutionary standpoint, we're mammals, so we're herd animals, and that's pretty obvious. There's a protection in the herd. But beyond that, human beings, our superpower is that we didn't physically evolve for the environment that we're in. Like squirrels can adapt themselves to fly between trees or hibernate in the desert, depends on the type of squirrel and the environment. Human beings were not really that different physically, so we placed our one big bet, and that is to grow a big brain and learn from the tribe around us the stuff we need to survive in a particular environment. The tribal package of Eskimos is very different than Australian Aborigines. And so you have to have a big brain that's plastic enough to learn your tribal knowledge. But at the same time, it's a very sparsely populated world. So if you came across other tribes, there's a good chance they're going to kill you, enslave you, or rape you or something. And so the psychology of human beings is tribe on tribe conflict. And so if you had a tribe, there were two requirements. One is you had to be cohesive and pass on the cultural package of your tribe, but also that there was an edge to it, that you say, we are not this, we stand against that. So there was always polarization built into it and a distrust of strangers and an othering, if you will, to talk about it in a progressive political terms.
Yeah, I talk a lot about othering myself in my work, and I think that it's the downfall of humanity, but it is in that sort of primitive psychology, absolutely. And yet, when we look at Darwin and the misquotes of Darwin, people think it's the survival of the fittest, but it's the survival of those who can evolve together. It's our ability to work out how to come together that is the higher level than the othering of let's kill the other tribe.
Well, it's both. What I'm saying is they're flip sides of the same coin. You have to be a loyal team player. That's not optional. In fact, we're wired to suppress our own direct life experience and instead substitute the cultural package, especially in times of stress and fear and conflict. So we become more loyal, more polarized, all of that, and we just throw out our own direct experience. On the other hand, who are we fighting against? There's always an edge to that. There's always a clear, that's not us. We don't stand for that, and we won't put up with that. So the problem is we evolved to have our cultural package be in one single tribe. We were surrounded by about 100 to 200 other people. A third of them were in some way related to us genetically.
Yep.
And it's a good chance that they had a real good lay of the land for the particular environment we were in. But now we have these overlapping cultures. We have, like you, the short-haired tribe, right? Or the Mercedes driver tribe, or the parent currently of two teenagers tribe. In a modern civilization, we don't have a single tribal allegiance. We have overlapping tribes that are activated in different contexts. And so the question is, which are the most resonant for you in the moment?
Yeah, and that's the thing you just said there that I think is really important for people to grasp today, is that you're actually in multiple tribes, and I call them overlaying circles, so you can think about it. And which one is at the top depends on what's going on at the time. It's the context. So the interesting thing about it for me is how willing human beings are to trade one for another depending on certain circumstances. You did some really, really great work, and I think it's really important for people to understand, which is about initiation. I ask people this all the time, what religion are you? They'll say, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim, whatever it might be. And my answer is, why? And they go, well, that's my religion. Yeah, but why? Well, I was born as a... And we can go why for about 400 years into those whys and realize that it's actually not a choice until it is. Until it is. And there's an initiation into that tribe, whether it's a religious faith or whatever it is. So we deliberately initiate people into a tribe. Talk to us about this power of deliberately initiating people into your tribes.
I have a bone to pick with you and a disagreement about the role of religion in this, regardless of which one you subscribe to, which notion of the origin myth or the Godhead or the universe. Religion has a huge advantage over most cultural transmission, which is you start getting brainwashed at birth. You're literally immersed in it, okay?
Yep.
And that's why they're really effective at propagating themselves.
Yes.
Because you get the hands on a human being when they're still completely moldable clay before anything is experientially in their life is wired in. The first 5, as we call it, in terms of brain development, the first 5 years. And so that's why they have this huge edge of being transmissible. You're literally born into it. You don't know any different. Most other tribes that are chosen tribes later in life are something that you can ask people why about, but asking them about why of their religion, for me, that conversation would have stopped with, you were born into it.
Yeah, but you see, we're actually agreeing. We're just looking at it from another point. So my point exactly is, you never made the choice. That's why I'm asking you why. It's because you never made the choice. My language, if you didn't choose it, it's not yours.
Mm-hmm.
It just became yours by default.
Osmosis. There's basically, again, to put it in cartoonish terms, there's a trap door in our house, or in our head rather, for cultural knowledge to get backdoored into us, and we have no control over it. So social pressures and everything else around us work automatically and socialize us to be good team players in our tribes.
But again, until we have an awareness where we can step up and choose.
Right.
And that's why I want to come into this piece around initiating people into a tribe, because it seems in many ways that oftentimes that means subjugating my own consciousness, subjugating my own higher thinking.
That all sounds conceptual. Let's take it back a couple of 100,000 years ago to the Serengeti. So modern humans, we came out of East Africa. So maybe the last 10,000 years, some of us have been farming and forming stable communities in modern civilizations, but 190,000 of those 200,000 years were spent on the plains of East Africa. So that's really, as particularly humans, of course, there's all the stuff that we built on top of as mammals and primates and so on. But as specifically humans, we evolved for that setting. And again, I know this is a bit cartoonish than reductionist, but since human babies are so helpless, the women were the primary keepers of the babies, which meant they couldn't be very mobile. You have this big-headed blob that's really fat, and you have to carry it around, can't even walk for a year, right? So the women are relatively stationary. The men's psychology evolved for being in hunting packs. So the women are doing the gathering, the men are doing the hunting. And so modern initiations, if they're done intentionally, essentially borrow the mechanics of what it took to bond a group on the Serengeti and during a hunt. Like you said in your intro, if you're forming a book club or an elite military unit or a cohesive organization or corporate culture, the mechanics are all the same of how to initiate people. The cultural package around which you're initiating is going to be radically different depending on what you're trying to do. But the mechanics of that are exactly the same. It's what we evolved for. And so if you build it on that foundation, you're much more likely to get that loyalty and bonding of people into your tribe.
I know you've outlined it, and we're going to want to get really into the details of it, because people can understand. I believe you said there are 5 particular parts of that process. But
right.
Do you think that those parts are sort of unconsciously inherent, that we understand them unconsciously and we are initiating people into our tribes unconsciously? Or do you think that we get initiated unconsciously, or maybe both?
I think the most successful, again, tribes and cultural packages transmitted across years and generations have more of these elements in them. They may not know the reasons they're doing stuff, but into their rituals, into their practices, into the mechanics of the initiations, they're putting in the right elements, and that's why they're more effective. But I'd say before we get into the 5 strategies for creating an effective initiation, I want to talk about the fact that we choose our leaders. Like you say, okay, maybe a religion you're indoctrinated into before you know it. But if you're saying you're making a conscious decision to join a tribe, the reason we do that is because there's something in the leader that we want to value, that we think gives us a survival edge. And people talk about all kinds of like servant leadership this and listening leadership that. And to me, there's one basic unassailable definition of a leader, and that is somebody's willing to follow you. I know that sounds really trite, but it's not. You have something I want, and by associating with you and giving up some of my autonomy to you and subordinating myself to you, I get some benefit. It's just that practical. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen on a consistent basis. And so in a way, we need to start the conversation about initiation as to the personal purpose and the vision of a leader. Because if that's not compelling, no one's going to follow you.
I think you're absolutely right. So before we get into those 5 pieces, at the last part of part 1 of the show, let's talk about it in a cult mentality. I studied cult psychology 150 years ago. when I was young.
You're remarkably well preserved for a fossil.
It's fascinating because people look at people who are in cults as idiots. And my research showed that very often people in those cults were PhDs, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were certainly not intellectual idiots. There was something deeply compelling within that cult for them. And for me, this is my answer, it boils down to that there's a need the person going into the cult, have that I perceive as being given in that cult. And that coupled with this need to belong, which again is tribal and part of who we are. So if you're going to meet the need that I'm missing and I'm going to feel like I belong, then I'm going to come into this tribe and I am going to subjugate my own intellectual process in order to be in it. Whether that is a cult called the Jones cult,
the Hale-Bopp Comet,
yeah, whoever it might be, or whether it's the cult of extreme left or extreme right.
It could be Apple versus Samsung phones. It's just a degree. They're all, in a way, cults or tribal affiliations. And certain ones, like you say, are just activated much more fundamentally and completely. The only thing I would say is you're still overvaluing the rational brain. When you say I have to suspend my intellectual brain in order to join your cult, I think it's a much more subtle process. And again, our need to be part of a group to which we belong and that provides us protection and a survival edge, that's again built in. It has nothing to do with intelligence or suspending objective reality. It's just we're wired to survive in tribes.
So when I say subjugate your own intellect, I'm not talking about it as in getting into the tribe, but protecting the tribe. And that's an interesting thing for me, is because I don't have to subjugate my intellect to become part of the cult. But when I'm intellectually challenged around it, my intellect may very well go and go into a screaming fit because it can hear your rationale and make sense of it, but that is going to get overridden by this need to belong. Do you see it differently or the same?
No, that's certainly the same, but I think you sincerely become what you believe. So there's no longer that dissonance is my point. It's not like this really bifurcated thing going on inside of you. You become a true believer, and then there is no inconsistency anymore. That's a gradual process, but it does happen. So that removes that conflict inside of you, I think, to a large degree.
So let's bring that to very contemporary times. As we record this, it's an election. As we're recording this, it's tomorrow, and as it's released, it'll be last week. So that's the point. And there are people who were very much against Trump who are now pro-Trump. There were people who were very pro-Trump who were very much against Trump. There's an intellectual awakening. It's like, and I say that in quotes again, it's as if there's an intellectual awakening. I've woken up from being in this cult mindset. Or there is also an awakening going the other way, which is I've awakened from the sleep of the left and I've joined this thing on the right. Because both sides are talking about how this is an indoctrination. It's a fascinating thing for me, particularly when I see people shift over. Elon Musk was very much on the left before it became a radical left, in his words, and now he's standing on the stage with Donald Trump. Take the vice president under Trump, who was very Trump, and now says he will not support him. Talk to us about that. That's that conflict, again, with the intellect versus the instinct.
Well, what you have is a kind of a tipping point where another tribe becomes more compelling, so you're willing to take that leap across, which again usually involves an initiation, which we'll focus on in the second part of this interview. So their identities aren't static. They're still influenced by the environment in which we operate. For example, I think if you're in law enforcement and you deal with really troubled, hurt units, if you're dealing with people with drug addiction and abuse in their past, you kind of get a cynical view of what human beings are, probably. Whereas hopefully as a school teacher molding young minds and you see the potential of them, you probably have a more optimistic and utopian view than you deserve. It's possible that shifts over time. The teacher can become jaded after seeing how disengaged their students are for decades and decades and so on. So it's not a static thing, but I would say that our feelings can change based on the environment we're in and how that affects us and how long we've been in it and how traumatic it is to stay in it. So we might be looking for a jump. We just don't know what we want to jump to is maybe the best way to put it.
I'm really fascinated by this embeddedness that we get, like you talked about the indoctrination into a tribe. And then it seems like it's impossible to move somebody from that. And then suddenly I'm really interested in that trigger that says, no, I'm going to go to the other tribe.
I think it's a tipping point. It's not a trigger. It's not anything you can manufacture. I think it was a Hemingway quote. Someone was asked in one of his books, or maybe he was asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he goes, slowly at first, and then all at once. It's kind of like this slippery slope, that the tipping point. But what's the accretion of little things that led to that? They could have gone on for years. I don't know that you can just manufacture a transition event or convince someone to all of a sudden join another tribe. They have to want to do it.
It's very interesting. And I'm sure we'll understand it better as we go through those 5 steps. We're already at the end of part 1 of this episode. And of course, our conversations always go so fast, and I enjoy them very much. But I really want to make sure that people understand where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources. So would you please tell them about that, Tim, before we get into part 2?
Sure, happy to. At this point, after having run, as you mentioned, a digital marketing agency for over 20 years, I'm focused on public speaking and advising senior executives at companies. So you can find information at timash.com, TIMASH.com, or about my latest book, Evolutionary Psychology, and how that applies to business and leadership as well, primalbrain.com. And the book is called Unleash Your Primal Brain, Demystifying How We Think and Why We Act. And you can get it on Amazon. If you want to hear my voice for 5+ hours, you can get it on audiobook. It's everywhere. Plus the international translations, of course.
Yeah, and I highly recommend it, having read it and loved the book. And as I said, I always love our conversations. By the way, if you didn't catch it, we'll make sure that all those links are in the show notes. We're going to be back for part 2 of this delicious conversation with Tim Ash in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you might be in a cult without even knowing it, and just the way that you're thinking, and what does it take to initiate people into your tribe as a leader of your own culture. And remember, the root of the word culture and the root of the word cult are exactly the same. We're going to be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.